Welcome everyone. My name is Holly Murphy and I'm the Advanced Practice Leader of Trauma-Informed Care at the Advocate Health Center. We welcome you here today to learn more about an introduction to trauma-informed care in the school setting. We would first like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. We'd also like to mention that this is a partnership between IWK Health and the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. This is a great partnership that we're looking at how we can partner together to create different learning opportunities and supporting our workforce. As we start this presentation, please keep in mind to be comfortable, find a comfortable place. Know that we will be talking about trauma today, also trauma-informed care and resiliency. So there may be things in the presentation that you may reflect upon that may be upsetting as you think about it in the context of students that you work with, or even in the context of yourself and your family. So please take care of yourself throughout the presentation. Please feel free to pause at any time because you do have that luxury to do that with this presentation. So we welcome you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Today's learning objectives are first to create an awareness of trauma and trauma-informed care. And then the second one is to look at how the principles of trauma-informed care look in the school setting and in the classroom setting. So when I say trauma, what comes to mind for you? So when we talk about trauma, we really use a broad definition. So we're really looking at trauma as being anything that overwhelms somebody's capacity to cope. And these can be various things that we'll get into in a moment. And we also want to mention that it can happen at the personal level, it can happen in someone's family, it can happen within a collective culture or group of people. So we want to keep it known that it does happen in many levels, in many ways. So what may cause trauma? So it may come to mind things such as war, natural disasters, maybe if an accident happens, thinking about abuse or violence. And what also may cause trauma too is looking at things that have happened in society. It could be in the past or in the present. So things such as racism that currently is happening, thinking about things in the past such as residential schools, thinking about people that may have lost their jobs or are homeless, and thinking about in the context of the children and youth that we work with, thinking about their families. And are their families, maybe they're not experiencing certain things directly, but maybe their parents are, their grandparents are, maybe there's some intergenerational trauma in the families and experiences that they have had that haven't been great for them. And also in the school setting, we want to be thinking about trauma that may be happening, such as bullying in the schools. So we know that that can happen as well. So we want to be thinking about all these different types of trauma. And if we think about our children and youth as well, we want to be thinking about things such as abuse and neglect. So what are the common effects of trauma? So when you think about children in your classroom that you may know have experienced trauma or may not even know that they've experienced it. So there's a variety of things that they can experience. So you may see a child that is very withdrawn, has their hoodie over their head, is feeling that they're not able to make many friends, is having difficulty concentrating. You may have children that are very maybe upset or depressed in the school, in the classroom. They may be feeling that they want to self-harm. You may learn that they're using substances, or you may learn that they're also feeling a bit of shame about themselves, or they're not having a great feeling about their identity and who they are. So trauma can show up in many different ways, and we see this in many different ways in our children and youth that we work with. One study that really was a big study for trauma and trauma-informed care, really looking at adverse childhood experiences, was a study done by the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente in the United States. So they did look at adults that had experienced trauma as a child. So they looked and they asked these people, have you experienced any neglect as a child, physical or emotional? Have you experienced any abuse? So that could be emotional, physical, or sexual. Or have you had any, they called household dysfunction in your family. So if you had someone in your house that had experienced mental illness, maybe some substance use, where your mother was treated violently, divorce in the home. So they asked all these questions really looking to see what people experienced. And what they found out was quite alarming. So in that study, about 67% of them said they experienced at least one of those ACEs. Women were more common than men to experience 5 or more ACEs. And we also found out some stats about in childhood, About 87% of children and youth said they experienced a traumatic event and actually associate it with having suicidal ideation or suicidal attempt. The other thing the ACEs found is that as people moved from childhood and adolescence into adulthood, they found out that the more ACEs you had, the more likely you were to have physical and mental health illnesses. So you're more likely to have heart disease, cancer, depression, anxiety. So many of these diseases they found out later, again, the more ACEs you had, the more likely you were to develop these. The other thing that we wanted to show was the pyramid. So the original ACEs pyramid started with the adverse childhood experiences, but over the past couple of years, they've added a couple of bottom tiers, which is really great. Because we do know the impact of generational trauma, historical trauma has an impact on children and youth. We know that the social conditions, so people are growing up in poverty, don't have access to education. This can also be looked at in the local context, what is happening in our communities, and are they supported? And then as we look into ACEs and we think about our children and youth that we're in the schools with, we may start to see disrupted neurodevelopment in the school setting. In elementary, we may start to see them not being able to concentrate, again, not having those great pro-social relationships, and not being able to really function as well as they might want to in the school setting. And then when we see them as teenagers, we may see them adopting health risk behaviors such as using drugs or alcohol. They may start having unprotected sex and different high risk behaviors such as those. And then into adulthood, we tend to see those diseases that I mentioned show up. So the heart disease, depression, anxiety, cancer, and also some social problems. And if they engaged in some activities as youth that may have been high risk, maybe now they're becoming a bit more in trouble with the law, or there's other outcomes associated with that. And the other thing that they noticed with the ACEs study is that if you had 7 or more ACEs, it actually could take years off your life, so up to 20 years off your life expectancy, and that is huge. So we talked about the US study, so now we're going to talk about the Canadian stats. So how common is it in Canada? So when we looked at this, we found some studies looking at Canadians, and at least 76% of them have experienced one traumatic event. In an ACEs study done in Alberta, they concluded that 56% of the population had experienced at least one ACE, and having one ACE score increased the probability of experiencing another by 84%. So we also do have some data from Nova Scotia and Lunenburg that tells us that 73% of the participants in that study had at least one ACE score, and 31% had 4 or more. So this is quite high in Nova Scotia. So that is something that we want to take into context, that we do know that trauma is prevalent, and it is prevalent in Nova Scotia. On the flip side of trauma is resiliency. So we can think of a lot of students, a lot of children, a lot of youth, families that have gone through really hard things and that we may even define as traumatic, but they may not define it as traumatic, and they're very resilient. They're able to cope, they're able to adapt, and we're quite frankly in awe of them that they've gotten through all of that. And the research really indicates that it's not the objective severity of the event that makes it traumatic, but it's a person's perception. So if they perceive it as traumatic, it is traumatic. And if they don't perceive it as traumatic, then it isn't to them. So that is something really to think about when you're working with children and youth. The other piece that we want to mention, and some great research from Michael Unger, is really looking at the context and really looking at the ability of people and individuals to navigate their way to the resources that they need is really important, and able to negotiate these resources to be provided in culturally meaningful ways. So really looking at, as a community, as individually, how do we help these students navigate our systems? How do we help them to find meaningful resources from them that are culturally meaningful for them? Another big message that we want to get out there is healing and resilience building happens in relationships. So as people working in the school system, this is really huge. So you may be the first person that this child or youth has even trusted or built a healthy relationship with, and this is where healing happens. So by you just being present, being there, being a safe adult, it makes a big difference in that child or youth's life. So now we're going to talk about what is trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is a universal, proactive, strength-based approach looking at how we understand trauma, knowing that it's prevalent, knowing that different people respond differently, and that we need to respond to meet their needs. And the principles of trauma-informed care are really used as guideposts that create safety both in the psychological sense, physical sense, and cultural sense. And we want to do this for both our students, their families, and for us as staff working in that system. The principles of trauma-informed care are 5 principles, and the first one is safety. So we're looking at how do we create safety in that physical, psychological, and cultural sense. So even walking into a school, does it feel welcoming to the students? If they're from diverse backgrounds, do they see themselves, in the artwork in the school? Are there ways that we can make it more welcoming? Do we have calming, corners in our areas in our classrooms? Are there ways that we can help children regulate and have those safe spaces? And also those safe relationships, which gets into the next principle, trustworthiness. So we want to create those safe, beautiful spaces, but they can be beautiful, but if we're not in a trustworthy relationship with the individuals, that's not really going to make it be trauma-informed. So we want to have those safe relationships with people, feeling that they can trust us, that we follow through what we're going to say we're going to do. And if we can't do something, that we're telling them that. We're being transparent and saying, I wish I could do that, but, this time I can't. So really just having that open, transparent, trustworthy relationship with people, letting them know what are the rules of the school, what are the boundaries, what does happen, what are consequences, because consequences do happen, and how do we work together to kind of meet those. And that's a part of collaboration. We really want to be working with the students and their families and us as partners, really finding out what is working for them and how do we work the best together. And when we look at the principle of choice, we're looking at, depending if we're working with a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, what is developmentally appropriate for them. So maybe the choice is just picking out what book do you want to read, or maybe it's what assignment do you want to do, kind of looking at what are the choices that you can offer that you can't actually offer. And empowerment is a really big one. So we know children and youth that have experienced trauma may not feel that they have a great self-identity, but they do have great skills, and we need to help them to identify those. So maybe they're really great at basketball, they're really great at math, they're really kind. So how are we identifying these things and really strengthening their identity by helping them to see the greatness in themselves? The other piece of trauma-informed care, as I mentioned, is it is for students and for families, but it's also for us. So it is for the staff working in the system. So unless we feel safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment, we're not going to be able to provide that for the students. So we really need to find out how do we feel that in our own systems. So the principles are the same for us. Do we feel safe physically, psychologically, and culturally in our environments? Do we feel that we're trusted in our work? Are our boundaries clear? Do we know what our jobs are and how to do them? And if we don't, how do we get help? Do we have choice in our day-to-day work? Are there things that we're really good at that would provide some empowerment for us and some joy? And are there ways we can embed that into our work? And do we also share power and collaboration? And do we feel part of the school and part of the changes that are happening? So thinking again how these principles apply to the staff. We really love this quote because it encompasses what we really want to happen. It's how do we do our job well while staying well? And really that's what it is. We get into these jobs because we want to help, we want to teach, we want to support people. And how do we continue to do those awesome jobs that we do while we also stay well? We want to be able to go home and be well for our family and our friends, as well as the students and families that we support. The other piece we want to talk about is community partnerships. Community partnerships are really important because, as we know, the students that we work with are not isolated just to the education system. They may also come in our health system. They may be in our justice system with other community partners. So how are we really figuring out as different systems and partners to communicate together to meet the needs that are best for that child? So how do we work together as systems? And we hope this is one way between the IWK and Department of Education and Early Childhood Development that we can do this. So I want to take a moment for a reflection. And I want you to think about, how do the principles of trauma-informed care show up in your classroom or school? So how do you see safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment showing up? Are there things that you do well and want to celebrate? And are there things maybe that you could add to or you could change? When we look at trauma-informed care, we're really looking at really collectively coming together to kind of reach this goal. So this quote really encompasses what we're hoping for. Trauma-informed systems, principles, and practices support reflection in place of reaction, curiosity in lieu of numbing, self-care instead of self-sacrifice, and collective impact rather than siloed structures. So we hope collectively today that we can start to do that. We also want you to know that there are many other webinars that we have done in partnership with the IWK and the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. So we have a webinar that is just devoted to staff resiliency and wellness for educators. As I mentioned, a huge part of trauma-informed care is staff wellness. So you can check that out. And we also have another extension of this presentation. This is an introductory presentation, but another presentation is going to be looking at strategies to consider for creating a trauma-informed school environment. And that is an hour presentation that's going to look into strategies in the school and how to create classrooms that are trauma-informed and how to have those school environments that are trauma-informed. And the other presentation that we also have is child and youth grief and trauma and supporting children, youth, and staff. So we want you to check those out if you're interested, and also there's other links and websites there if you want more information. So I want to thank you today for taking the time to watch this webinar on Your Experiences Matter, an introduction to trauma-informed care in the school setting. And thank you, everyone.